looking forward towards speaking to Billy. I'm very much looking forward to that, because in the current environment, we've not been able to come to Strasbourg and see you. We have not been able to see you in Brussels in your building, and we haven't even been in Cork to see you. We basically haven't been able to see you in person at all, though I had the pleasure to speak to you in a number of occasions so far. I think we're delighted you're here with us, and I know you volunteered or were volunteered to be the rapporteur on DORA, and I think you've kind of been thrown into the deep end with one of the most complex files that this committee had to deal with, your committee, the Economic Monetary Affairs Committee, had to deal with since the Parliament was reconstituted in May 19 already. So it'd be interesting to speak to you not just about that, but I think also more broadly around the link between technology and financial services, which of course is also very important for your constituency. So welcome, Mr. Kelleher, Billy Kelleher, for being with us this afternoon or evening.
Thank you very much. Delighted to join you. Of course, with advances in technology, we don't have fireplaces anymore, so the fireside chat is very much a radiator and Zoom calls. Just to say at the outset, look, I'm delighted to be able to take part in this particular discussion. There's no doubt, I mean, the advances in technology and financial services over the last 25, 30 years, and particularly since the advance of the internet and all that has flown from that, has meant that, very often legislators, regulators are always grappling with the advances in technology and trying to play catch up. And now that we are completely globalized and interlinked, interdependent, clearly, we have to put some regulations and oversight in place to ensure a number of things. And first and foremost, of course, it is the integrity of the financial services in the European Union, to ensure that they're robust, that they have defense mechanisms in place, and that they are safe and secure, both in terms of data, but also ensuring that the actual financial services themselves are underpinned in a way that they aren't liable to be undermined by cyber attacks or other nefarious events as well. And, when we were all a little younger, we probably watched various movies and we saw science fiction, and saying, will this ever happen? What we saw only 20 or 30 years ago is now in everybody's home. It's in everybody's pocket in terms of mobile phone devices, just access to the internet, and being able to do so much with new technology. So we do need to put in place a system. And I'd like to put a system in place with my imprint on DORA to ensure that we maintain Europe in a competitive environment, that we ensure that it's future-proofed. In other words, that we don't end up with a situation where we have a regulation in place that freezes advances in technology, freezes advances in financial services and what financial houses can offer to customers, that we have this evolving mechanism and a review clause as well in DORA to ensure that if there are obstacles, that they can be reviewed and overcome, as I said, because this is an evolving technology and it also will be an evolving regulation. In discussions, Nick, with stakeholders, the real word that has been spoken about, and I suppose the issue that has raised most concern, is whether or not proportionality will be the cornerstone of DORA. I come from a centrist political view. That is where I've lived all my political life in terms of my political domain, both as a national parliamentarian in Ireland and now with my affiliation to the Renew Group in Europe. So I always come to issues not with an ideological view, but with a practical view on how we address these issues. And my overriding view has always been, when you're legislating, is proportionality. Proportionality is the definition that I would use most. And people would ask, well, what is that? Well, proportionality really means that you do not have to interfere beyond what is necessary. You do not have to supervise beyond what is necessary. And in the event of there being a breach of that supervision, you don't have to sanction or sentence beyond what is deemed fair and proportionate. So when you put all that together, I'd like to think that DORA will evolve to the point where it will be pro-enterprise. It will encourage and allow innovation and creativity and IP to continue to develop. And equally, it will be robust enough to guarantee the citizens of Europe that their financial services are underpinned with security systems for the modern era of the internet, technology, and ICT. So for all of that, they will be the guiding principles. Then, of course, how do you put that in place, Nick, is the next question. And as I said, I live and I inhabit a political world. So, I mean, clearly my view will not carry full weight across the entire European Parliament. So, I mean, you end up with a situation where you are in negotiations and discussions with other political groupings. And out of the Commission's proposals on DORA, you're going to have a reflection of political views then put on top of that. And hopefully they will reflect what I would hope would be a centrist view, one that isn't from the extreme left or the extreme right, and one that will allow us then to go into discussions and trilogue with the European Commission and the European Council based on a strong mandate to do what DORA set out to do in the first place, and certainly tweaking it to the point where some of the concerns that have been advanced by technology companies, by financial service companies, by regulators, and by stakeholders in general, to ensure that it's effective, it's fair, it's rational, it's implementable as well, and that we don't overburden the regulatory authorities and the supervisory authorities to the point where they are incapable or unable to oversee it because it is too detailed and too complex. So not light touch regulation, but regulation that touches in a way that is not necessarily observed on a daily basis, but does what it's meant to do as well. So look, they're my initial thoughts. One of the big issues, of course, Nick, that maybe in your conference, it's a fintech conference. Very, very often, of course, we are in a situation now where many of the companies are not necessarily fintech companies. You probably could call them tech fin companies. They are primarily technology companies, and a huge number of companies that are in your space now, probably represented by and attend your conferences, but primarily they're technology companies. The vast majority of their employees will be engineers, will be software technicians, will be right across that particular sector, but they provide services that the financial area likes and uses quite a lot. But they would be primarily tech companies, and then of course you have financial houses that have no technology themselves other than their basic softwares they might, and then they have to employ ICT companies. And it's to get that balance right to ensure that we have very clear definitions between those that are ICT and those that are the financial services, which are obviously authorized through the financial services process in Europe. But the issue is the graying of the area in terms of ICT within companies, intra-company, and then obviously third-party providers and critical third-party providers as well. So look, you're people that are in that space, so you fully understand it. As I said, I inhabit a political space, and very often politicians may take a more helicopter view of issues, and the detail can sometimes, keep them away from getting too involved in the real discussions. And that's why sometimes you will see a broader discussion underpinning or sort of on top, I should say, of DORA. So when DORA goes through the political process, you will see people attaching many other issues to it. They'll be calling about money laundering, for example. They'll be calling about taxation issues. They'll be talking about many, many issues. But that's the broad brush of political debate. What we need to do in the committee is to refine all that down into the issue in front of us, which is the actual DORA regulation itself, and how we fine-tune that so that your companies and the businesses that are at your conference today will be able to thrive, prosper, and as importantly, citizens in Europe and governments in Europe and the Commission in Europe can have confidence that we have cybersecurity systems in place that can guarantee the robustness and the resilience of the financial services themselves.
Thank you, Billy. I think I much appreciate getting this kind of perspective of your thinking at the moment as you're still in the early stages of reflecting on your report. If you may kind of pick up on a few themes that you've raised and add one or two more. You start with proportionality, and I think that's good. It's very important, and you raised it both in the context of avoiding complexity and just also in relation to enforceability. But one of the other issues when it comes to cybersecurity is that you're only as good as your weakest link. So if there's one person in the chain that is, let's say, less sophisticated because they're small, they're specialized, they could kind of create havoc through the whole system. And in a way that speaks against proportionality. I don't know how you, I don't know, but have you thought about how to square that circle or how we could?
Yes, Nick, I think a lot of the time when people are speaking about cybersecurity and critical third-party providers and all of that, they very often are looking at it through the prism of the big companies. And you are right. Proportionality should not be based on the size of the company. It should be based on the size of the risk. And we're going to have to look at that to ensure that, like a small company could be a critical providing critical services, but like just because it's small doesn't mean it's not critical. So we have to ensure that we have systems in place that can oversee them as well and supervise them as well. So it's not necessarily that we should always base it on size, but more so on the critical risk factor. And that is an area that I think, when you look at the actual file as published by the Commission itself, I just think we need to try and fine tune that to identify what is critical risk. And as you say, the weakest link could be, a very small company, but it could be providing very critical services. And of course, then you have the other challenge. Small companies, by their nature, may not have the same resources as large companies. So to address the issue of innovation and creativity and allowing new entrants into the market and continually evolving innovation, we need to ensure that small companies, if they are going to outsource and use the third-party critical providers, there has to be some template in place where they're not obligated to do the due diligence. In other words, if you're asking a small company to do a risk assessment report on an international third-party provider, they won't have the capability to do it. So we need to find some template there as well, and framework where small companies will be able to use a template that the large critical third-party providers are at, so they don't have to do due diligence themselves. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the capacity, the capability, and it could stop small companies coming into the market and providing services and innovation as well. So there'd be two areas where small companies, both in terms of the critical risk, is an issue of concern, and also in the area of how they would actually do a due diligence on critical third-party providers themselves.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's important because actually in our conference we've got a whole mix from technology companies and big financial institutions, but also smaller payment providers or specialized companies. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges in this whole file, is to find that right balance. And you raised the second point there, which is the point of complexity, because one concern we hear a lot is about the prescriptive nature of the proposal. It's already quite prescriptive in the number of reports that need to be written, the way they need to be written. And then what we always enjoy in the European process is once you at some stage have finished your work on the primary legislation, you'll be kind of scrutinizing secondary legislation, and then you'll be kind of getting the ESA chairs in to give you evidence on guidelines that they might adopt, and so on and so forth. So the level of granularity just increases at every layer. How do we balance kind of outcomes-based or risk-based results with this level of complexity in reporting and potential box ticking?
Yes, again, box ticking will not resolve any weaknesses in cybersecurity or threats to financial services. But what we need to do is establish a principle-based framework first. That would set out the broad principles of what we're trying to achieve, making sure that there's enough scope then in the secondary legislation and in level 2 to ensure that there can be flexibility. Look, primary legislation is more difficult to amend and to change, but really what you need to do is to ensure that we have a principles-based framework. It sets out the broad parameters, and then underpinning that would be discussions with the European supervisory authorities and others to ensure that it's flexible. Equally, I think, Nick, what will be very important in this, I'd like to see some mechanism of a review clause in it. I would just hate to think that we would just freeze it in time, that it's published, it's implemented, and that's it. I just think that we have to have a review clause, and that there should be some forum whereby stakeholders, supervisory authorities, political input as well, could be done on a rolling basis to ensure that if there are difficulties, they can be resolved. If there's weaknesses, that they can be enhanced, and that we don't create barriers to further innovation and creativity. And then on top of that as well, look, there's many other reports. You have MIFID, you have NIS, you have the PSD2. We don't want duplication. And I'm very, very conscious of the need to avoid putting further burdens on business and on our competitiveness. Like, box ticking is fine, but if you have to tick an awful lot of boxes for an awful lot of different regulators based on very different oversight regulatory regulation or directives, well, then it becomes very, very cumbersome, both for big and, but more importantly, for small companies as well. They just simply would have to hire too many people that would be based on just on this particular box ticking exercise. So to avoid all of that places barriers to competitiveness, I'd like to streamline that to ensure that there's no duplication obligations on companies.
I think that's very refreshing to hear, because indeed, as you say, there's this danger that, not just when it comes to the actual compliance, but also the reporting that flows from it. You report to different authorities at different times in different contexts. And there's also spin-offs from this. For example, you mentioned the PSD. It's led to a whole framework around secure communications and when and how APIs can be used or cannot be used. So interfaces for different parties to cooperate in the payment chain. So I think that is very, very refreshing to kind of really have a clear demarcation which rules apply when. I think one thing we hear there is that DORA is very much focused, as you rightly say, on cybersecurity, on ICT, I should rather say, ICT security. But in reality, ICT is hard to distinguish from operational security or from critical infrastructure, for which there's separate legislations. You mentioned the NIS directive. And the reporting frameworks is very different between them. So I think it's not just about the piece of legislation. I would urge you to also look at aligning these different reporting frameworks, because sometimes you don't know whether it's an ICT risk or an operational risk. Somebody then suddenly has to make a judgment and report it to different people. But that's maybe more an observation. You made a very good point about third-party providers and the interrelationship between them and financial institutions. Now, DORA foresees a whole new framework of oversight, not supervision, but oversight for these third-party providers, if and when they're deemed critical. I mean, it brings all these technology companies into the parameter of potential financial services oversight and regulation, something we've been discussing over these days. What do you think is the balance there? Because I like the EBA, but they're currently not the biggest expert in everything to do with digital security. The same applies for EIOPA or the EBA or ESMA. What is the balance there between financial oversight by financial supervisors versus other authorities?
Well, I mean, I think you raise a very valid point there. I mean, that's going to be one of the major issues around communication, how we actually communicate between the various supervisors to ensure that we have seamless mechanisms for reporting and seamless mechanisms for oversight. In other words, that we don't duplication of the regulations or directives, and equally we don't want duplication then on top of that with reporting and also oversight supervision as well. So, I mean, you take critical third-party providers. I mean, well, DORA is primarily, to ensure that we have financial certainty in terms of the integrity and robustness of our financial services, and there's no inherent cybersecurity risks or other risks as well, as you point out. But what we need to do is to also ensure that you could be regulating the financial services to the nth degree, but if they've outsourced all their services and if they're all stored in third-party critical providers who are in third countries as well, on top of that, to make it more complex in terms of being able to reach in to have some form of oversight, some form of supervision. I mean, we can talk about which words are the important ones, but the key issue here is to ensure that if they are critical third-party providers, that there is at least some way of the supervisory regulatory authorities being, at least to engage with them, to observe their infrastructure, their security infrastructure in the ICT world, to guarantee that the very least that if financial services are using it, that there is a certain standard. That's going to be, look, that's one of the great debates. I mean, we don't want a situation where we end up obligating companies that are critical third-party providers to have to locate in the European Union a certain element of their business so that the supervisors can have reach in. But at the same time, we can't have them completely removed and we incapable of either having some form of ability to inspect, to supervise in some way, or to oversee in some way, or to facilitate and guarantee to small businesses in the European Union that these particular companies are providing what they're saying they're providing. So, it's not one or the other. I mean, this requires a bit of ingenuity on our behalves to try and see how we actually oversee, but at the same time, not having it so prescriptive that companies will be either forced to come to the European Union and locate a certain amount in there, or else it will force more European companies not to locate in Europe at all and move elsewhere to be able to use those critical third-party providers. And that's the real reason. I mean, the idea that we could have sort of international disputes with huge companies because they're not locating a certain element of their business in Europe to provide oversight reach, I think would be a step way too far being truthful. So it's to get that balance right. And then on top of that, finally, just in terms of reporting, I mean, we have to be very careful here that we don't end up with every particular potential incident or event being reported to multiple supervisory authorities at the close of business every evening or within every 2 hours of the potential incident happening, or a perceived incident or a perceived event. I mean, we do need to get to a stage where the supervisory authorities, are informed of what is real risk and that they can investigate that rather than they having themselves completely overpowered or overburdened with lots of information, but in terms of it being critical or important is the issue. So I just think we need to try and fine tune that to make sure that what's reported is necessary and only necessary, and what's investigated is required.
Thanks, Billy. I think I'm happy that you come to the third country piece and the international dimension, because that is indeed one of the big concerns. It is about what is the right balance, and I think nobody has quite found that right balance yet. But what we clearly need to avoid is a scenario where there's data localization or where there's a fragmentation in cloud technologies or otherwise just to meet certain regulatory requirements. And I think if one were to roll the clock back, which one can't, and it's not meant as a criticism to the Commission at all, it might have been better if had some international solutions first and then implement them rather than the other way around. We will watch that very closely. Maybe one last point, which is linked to this, is around the enforcement. Because in a way, DORA is quite smart, but also a bit confusing in that it has two types of, maybe the word enforcement is too strong, but mechanisms to facilitate implementation. One is directly through the supervisor of each financial institution. So if a financial institution uses one of these third-party providers, they need to, be overseen by the respective financial supervisor. And that supervisor can ultimately, in the last resort, terminate contracts or otherwise take all kinds of decisions. On top of that, we have this oversight framework, which isn't really enforceable, but nonetheless, the overseer will provide recommendations to the technology provider. And therefore, of course, there's an incentive for that company to also meet those requirements. How do you think that double relationship should work? Do you think the Commission has balanced that well?
Well, look, I mean, when you look at oversight and the obligations of financial services who are using critical third-party providers, again, I raised that particular issue of, how do you define first and foremost? There has to be some form of definition. We know what a critical third-party provider is. That places additional obligations on financial service companies who are availing of these services. And of course, like, to get to a stage where these companies have obligations through the directives, but equally they have or not ethical, but they, in terms of their own name, their own reputation, they have reputational obligations as well. I mean, if companies are using third-party providers that aren't stepping up to the mark, well, clearly that is very damaging, could be potentially very damaging for their reputation. So, I mean, like, there is, you would assume, for the larger financial services, I mean, they're clearly going to be using ICT providers, critical third-party providers that will come under the scope, and there will be obligations on them from a reputational point of view to ensure that. But beyond that, I mean, what we need to do is put in place mechanisms how we consult and how we communicate. Small companies need to have assistance as well to ensure that they have confidence that, rather than being able to do due diligence themselves, as I said earlier on big critical third-party providers, but that they are guaranteed that they are reaching a certain threshold of quality and compliance with oversight and their regulatory obligations. Otherwise, we would cut out smaller companies coming into the system the whole time. So look, I think that is a key area. We do need to ensure that we have in place a system that ensures the integrity of our financial services wherever they're located. And that does mean having some reach into critical third-party providers and some way of sanction as well in the event of there being continual breach, be that probably more than likely on the financial services rather than on the ICT itself.
Thank you, Billy, very much for this half-hour conversation. I can say two things at the end of this, well, three things. Number one is, I see the file is very much in good hands. I made that point about, it's one of the toughest files to take on in the early part of this new parliament, but I know it's in good hands from hearing this, and I feel extremely reassured. Well, I knew it kind of, but it's nice to hear it kind of live in that context. The second point is, you're right, we call it Fireside Chats. It's kind of maybe a bit misnomer. The original, very first one we did was a cuppa with Sean, and that was a conversation with John Bergen, but we thought the cuppa was also a bit too informal. So we came back to the Fireside Chat. And lastly, I don't know whether you've got time, but if you can, maybe stay on and listen in, because we've now got Thomas Kurian, the CEO of Google Cloud, and Joachim Wurmeling, formerly an MEP and now a member of the Deutsche Bundesbank and leading on technology issues, joining my colleague Daniel Trinder. But first and foremost, Billy, thank you very much. That was very, very good.
Thank you very much.